Tiered skirts are one of the easiest types of clothing that you can design and create entirely on your own. The first step is deciding what you even want to make. I recommend going to Pinterest, Instagram, or looking at your favorite fashion blogger sites and finding every tiered skirt that you like. Once you have a nice collection, try and figure out what they have in common. How many tiers do they have? How long is each tier in relation to the others? How much swoosh do they have? Once you have an idea of what kind of skirt you want to make, you can get on to actually designing it. First, let's start off with how much volume the skirt needs, and the width of each panel. The width of the first panel only really needs to be big enough to fit over the widest part of your butt with some ease, but the standard practice is to make this 2 times the circumference of your waist. If you have a larger waist to butt ratio, I recommend double checking that it fits comfortably. But the volume really comes out of the difference between the first and second, and then the second and the third tiers. And the only way to determine what ratio leads to the amount of volume you want really is trial and error, or looking at examples. For instance, the skirt on the left is made with a standard 2 times, 3 times, 4 times pattern for each of the tiers. And then the skirt on the right is made with a 2 times, 2.5 times, and then 3 times pattern. While it doesn't look like there's a big difference while standing, you can definitely tell when you're twirling or the wind catches it. In the end, there isn't a right or wrong way to do this, as long as each tier is longer than the previous one. Next, let's figure out the length of each panel. To get the overall length you want, it's easier if you have measuring tape. Hold one end of the measuring tape down at the smallest part of your waist, and let the other end drape down. Then have someone else note down the measurement that meets your desired length. Then you divide that length by the number of tiers you want. That gives you a rough estimate of how long each tier needs to be. If you want to play around with the ratio of the lengths of the different tiers, just subtract from some tiers and then add that length on to other tiers until you end up with the ratio that you want. Since you already have your overall length, playing around with the ratios won't affect how long your skirt is, but it will change the overall look and can give a slightly different illusion for your proportions depending on which tier is longer or shorter. Then, if you do want to have a precise length for your skirt, don't forget to add your seam allowances. Add twice your seam allowance to the middle tier, your seam allowance plus 1 inch to the bottom tier, and your seam allowance plus 2 inches to the top tier. But for my measurements and in the diagrams I'll show you, I didn't do this because I didn't particularly care about the precise length of the skirts that I was making. Now that you have your pattern, you need to figure out how much fabric to get. The easiest way I found to do this is just to get graph paper and then trace out roughly the width of the fabric that you plan on buying, divided by 2 if you're going to be cutting on the fold. For each tier that is wider than the width of the fabric, you'll need to break it into different panels and sew them together. As you'll see in my diagrams, each tier is made up of at least 2 panels. To get a better idea of how these panels correspond to a skirt, here's how each pattern translates to a skirt, keeping in mind that the fabric I'm using is 44 inches wide and I had 2.5 yards of fabric. And then for extra supplies, you'll need to get matching thread and 1 inch wide elastic. If you want to have a wider waistband, you can do that, but just make sure you add additional fabric to your tier. Now that you have your design, you can join me for part 2 where we actually work through how to sew it.